Welcome to the Shiva Gallery at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Come over here first. Hi, my name is Makushla. I'm the director of the Anya and Andrew Shiva Gallery at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And this is the show that I curated titled What It Is About You That Closes and Opens. The title is taken from a poem by Cummings, which reads, "I do not know what it is about you that closes and opens, only something in me understands the voice of your eyes is deeper than all roses." But while the poem is an amorous kind of love poem, the exhibition explores this idea of opening and closing as a gestural language and looks at the work of a range of different contemporary artists who engage with themes of gesture and gender and the kind of subtle politics at play in all of those things. On this front wall, we have a work by Camila Godoy. There are more works of Camila's in the exhibition project as a whole, but I wanted to start with this image, which is a gathering together of an archive of photographs of people's hands reaching out to one another, because I think it captures some of the tension and politics at play in the idea of opening and closing. I've talked about tenderness and violence being threaded through the works in the exhibition and about this idea of being able to close oneself as a fundamental right, but also the ability to be vulnerable being a special experience, but then that vulnerability also entails a kind of openness to the possibility of violence. So I love a paradox. This exhibition is really sitting at the intersection of a range of different tensions and complexities. And I think as we go through the exhibition, you'll see how some of the works unfold the theme in very different ways. So let's start over here with Odette England. So this is an artwork by contemporary photographer Odette England. And you'll see a range of books. And what I'm about to do is a part of the participatory practice of the work. In this work, the artist has invited members of the public who identify as female to take a lipstick and to trace their handprint over a photograph of a man holding a gun or a man holding a camera. And in this way, the artist is asking that we reclaim, in some sense, the sense of ownership and agency that is sometimes taken away with images as well as with weaponry. You can see that the photographs that are gathered here in this book, in this work, which is called Woman Wearing Ring Shields Face from Flash, bring together images of men holding cameras, men holding guns, and women going like this and trying not to be photographed. That gesture of refusal of being photographed speaks to a larger history that's at play in the work, which is the co-evolution of the gun and the camera. And there is quite a rich and deep history at play in these two ergonomic machines that are designed to point and shoot. We shoot a gun, we shoot a photograph. That homonym is not accidental. So the work teases out the intimacy of photography and of being photographed without necessarily wanting to be, and weaves it through with a whole kind of gendered history of being imaged and of the violence that goes along with the idea of the gun. You'll see this work occupies a table, and that's because we want to invite people in the audience to come and participate, to trace their hands, to leaf through the books. There's a lot of different images at play here that tell the story in different ways. And so it's kind of an inviting space, but also a space of contention. And for me, that actually speaks to this really epic work, which is a banner by Sharon Hayes that is titled What It Reads Out. So the banner reads, "Now a chasm has opened between us that holds us together and keeps us apart." And for Sharon Hayes, there is this real interplay of intimacy and emotional lives entangled with political and public lives. So she's been known to stand on street corners in New York City and read aloud love letters that speak to larger political themes. And in a moment when questions around queerness and gay rights are being opened and reactivated politically, this work feels particularly resonant. The sentence is of the artist's own devising, but it references this idea put forth by Hannah Arendt in her book on the human condition. The book deals with lots of different aspects of being human, as does this show, but for Arendt, it actually speaks to the idea of a table, which she thinks of as a political metaphor. You know, we talk about wanting to have a seat at the table, but also as a thing that keeps us apart. When you sit at a table across from somebody, you both face them and are oriented towards them and are kept apart from them. There's a physical barrier between you. So the table is a more complex metaphor at play here and in Arendt's work than we might sometimes first assume when we talk about being invited to the table, having a seat at the table, conviviality. All of those things, political power, agency, they all come with the complexity of human interaction, which is something that we don't often have ways of speaking about. So I really liked that this artist found a way of echoing that. You can see also that it's a really large curtain. It has the vernacular visual language of protest, but it also, to my mind, recalls the domestic and intimate sphere. And it literally is something that closes off the street view that's behind it. So the idea of closing and opening is active also in the very form of the work itself. All right, we're going to come over here and have a conversation about mothering. I have two works in this show that are by the artist Freya Powell, and both of these are very, very fragile, delicate, gentle pieces that speak to her unique relationship with her son. So both are titled Out of the Unexpected, 2 and 3, and that actually comes from a poem by Sappho as translated by Anne Carson in If Not Winter. I'm fascinated by the idea of the plaster cast as almost like a photograph, a non-reproducible moment in time that's at work in these, and the tenderness of this tiny hand holding, it's holding its mother's hand, and the idea of kind of negative space that forms around these pieces. So they are pieces that speak to a very unique personal relationship between mother and child. And in the larger context of the exhibition, they also speak to the labor of mothering. So this piece here, the hands that are held out to hold up a child. And so this idea of weight and picking up that tiny body is very present in the work and in the idea of the feminine or feminized labor that's at play in this piece. And I've intentionally, as a curator, put it in conversation with a piece over here that I think troubles and complicates it a little bit. So let's go and look at Danica's work. So this is a video performance by Danica Netzovich, which is called Not the Mama. But the work itself is a little bit more complex than that reference. So here Danica rocks and cradles a space where a child might be, but is not. This is not a performance that involves a baby, it's a performance that involves an empty space. So much like Freya Powell's piece that we just looked at, where the hands reach out to hold the child is not there. In this work, Danica is very interested in unpacking that dynamic about mothering and what mothering means. And for me especially, it seemed like a very timely moment to think about the kind of affect and cultural space that we have for women, people who are assigned female at birth who are not mothers. This idea of biological necessity attaching to the role and the labor of the mother. Danica specifically asks, does one have to have given birth in order to be a mother? So she's complicating that language and that relationship around care and the hierarchies that go into it. You can see that same conversation being continued over here in this work by Clementine Keith Roach. So in this work by Clementine Keith Roach, we see a large vessel that is supported by 3 female figures holding it up. The one here is squeezing her breast, which makes sense of this milky substance that's in the piece. The work itself is called New Morning 2, and it's in the artist's words, a kind of a monument and a memorial to separation. So it marks a moment in her life when her child stopped breastfeeding. But to me, it also recalls and thinks about this lexicon of the gestural language of ancient Greek and Roman statues, which were reprised in the Roman period, and then again in the neoclassical moment. This idea of the female form that holds up the architecture, that holds up the space. It literally is bearing the weight of history on their shoulders. And you can see it around here with this beautiful stretch of the hand. This figure that's standing here, literally supporting a vessel that is so huge, and carrying the weight of the architecture. In the ancient Greek tradition, often women hold up architectural spaces, and they're known as caryatids. There's something very profound to me here about the body gendered female and the body's gestural repertoire of holding, which often doesn't look like physical strength, but is in its stillness actually an incredibly physically active thing to be doing. I've installed the work in front of this series of pieces by Camilo Godoy. And again, it's that thing about setting up relationships and pairings. There's at work in these some Grecian vessels and this idea of the gestural repertoire that I think echoes, but represents a very different version and a very different gendered notion of the vessel that's at play. So Camilo is an artist who works with choreography, and this collection of works, which are called choreographic studies, bring together a whole array of images that he's collected over years. Some of them are of himself dancing, so there's quite a few of him here. Some are art historical objects, some are more like moods than images. And there's this book that influenced me a lot when I think about this work, and it's called The Archive and the Repertoire by Rebecca Taylor. I can remember names, where she talks about how we've sort of privileged the idea of the archive and of paper goods and material products in the way we think about history. And she comes up with the idea of the repertoire to think about how we might archive the body's gestural language. So I see this as both an archive and a repertoire, or it's an archive of a repertoire that's at play in the way that the work gathers together all of these still moments from a series of gestures and movements and corporeal embodied forms that are at play in Camilo Godoy's choreographic work. To me, there's something very powerful about the way that this work also taps into different global art histories and speaks to maybe the ways that bodies remember motion and movement over generations, over millennia, really. There's different genders at play here, different corporeal gestures and movements, and different emotions at play, all of which are available to the artist through this archiving process. Sometimes you even see, just like here, where we're not even seeing the body, we're just seeing the fingerprints marking, I think, the surface of a photocopy machine, where you get that idea and that sense of touch and a history and repertoire of touch that's available to all of us. Camilo works with movement and the lively body, and I'm really fascinated by the way that here he's also managed to condense all of this kind of choreographic information about the queer male body into this collection of images that come from lots of different times and lots of different places, and some of which are documentations of his own body living out some of what is collected and archived here from art history. We're going to go now to look at a couple of quilts. So in this exhibition, there are two beautiful textile pieces by the artist Zach Foster. And Zach is a quilter and works with the tradition of church banners. Both of these works, they actually sit in quite a bit of tension with one another. They share the same gestural language of being hand sewn and beautiful soft things made from recycled materials. But one of them tells a story of a really charged encounter at a flea market where a lot of homophobia comes up, and the artist is relaying this story in a fairly open-ended, ambiguous way to talk about what it's like to be mistaken for straight and invited into a kind of amity through homophobia, and the abilities we do or don't have to resist and push back against those in social encounters. So it's what might be understood as a microaggression. It's a very, very small moment in his life, but it's been immortalized and given its due as an affective moment in the way that he has rendered it on a quilt. On the other hand, we have this piece, which reads, "In the heart's deep well, a burning ember still glows undoused." And I felt it was really important to have this work here too, because Zach, to me, is an incredibly optimistic, loving person from everything that I know about his work, and I wanted to have that sense of hope and joy and possibility at play in the exhibition, that even when you are downtrodden or marginalized, there's always this possibility and this burning ember of resistance that's at play in the human body. They're very sort of soft, gentle pieces, and they're all handmade out of recycled materials and different garments that have a lot of history built into them. So they're the kind of thing you want to wrap yourself up in. Please don't though, because you're not allowed to touch things in this exhibition. So remember how before we looked at a work called Not the Mama on the other side of the room by the artist Danica Netzevich. And this is also Danica's work. And she is here dealing with, again, a table. It's interesting how motifs recur when you curate shows. You don't even realize it at the time. But here the artist is lying on her belly on the floor of the gallery, and a coffee table, which comes from her family home, has been placed upside down on her back. And these people come and they lay rocks and bricks onto the top of the table. The video goes for about 11 minutes, and the artist deliberately does not know the weight of what she is taking on, but she worked it out carefully with her friends and in the collaboration that led to the work. And part of the reason she's insistent on not knowing the weight is that, like she says, we all carry things differently. We all carry the weight of our different responsibilities, anxieties, and lives differently, and they mean different things to all of us. So it was important for her not to quantify it, but you can see how much physically she struggles over the period of the performance to bear up and to breathe, really, under the weight of the rocks that are crushing down on her. There is a history of torture that goes into how we think about a work like this, but you can see that it's also a form of resistance and a declaration of strength. I think it's very important for Danica that the gesture of holding, which we've seen several other times in this show, is understood as a position of strength and a position of endurance. For the artist, this is an allegory of her work as a carer. Danica is the primary carer of her mother, who is disabled, and has been cared for her grandmother and grandfather until their deaths. And that labor of caring for the elders of our society is one of the least remunerated, least appreciated roles in society, and yet it's the kind of care that does not let up, and which takes an enormous amount of endurance and strength. You can see here underneath that for this installation we have gathered together a lot of rocks. These are not the rocks that are in the video, but ones that are taken from the Hudson River and will be returned at the end of the exhibition to their rightful place, but as a way of making palpable just the amount of weight that has gone into this video piece and that Danica's body is holding up throughout. Alongside this piece is a work that I think has a lot of nuance to it. So this is that a boy? Now, boy here, B-U-O-Y, is pronounced boy in the Caribbean, which is where this artist is from, and in Australia, which is where I'm from. So it's a homonym for the idea of a being misgendered in the water. On the left-hand side, you see the artist, Nadia Huggins, semi-submerged in the water, and on the right-hand side, you see a buoy or boy. And the similarity between the two is very a powerful kind of mistake that the viewer often experiences as well in this exhibition. For the artists, there is an experience of being gendered masculine in the water, and there's a kind of complex interplay here of metaphors where I think she's really leaning into embrace not the idea of misgendering, but the fluidity that is possible in the oceanic space. A buoy, when you really think about it, is something that's buoyant, it floats. It's inherently something that sits on the surface, and it inherently rises up with the tide. But the whole apparatus of a buoy is actually also anchored at the same time. It's used to mark underwater reefs and underwater hazards. So the idea at play here really is a little bit more complex than simply floating. It's floating while being tethered to something. It's something being a marker, something being only half visible. When you see a buoy in the ocean, or a buoy, you are seeing only half of the apparatus that's at play. That is, to me, a really powerful metaphor for gender as expressed by Nadia's work. This idea that there is so much more happening in each human life than is necessarily visible on the surface. On this wall, we've also put a poem by Isaac Essex, and Nadia and Isaac met whilst on residency at Duke University. We haven't had space to put the whole poem, but I encourage you to go and read it. The poem fragment that we've got here reads, "Sometimes I feel ocean water buoy my body. I submerge in an encounter with different chorus of sounds that gently slip through my salt-soaked hair. It is peaceful. I am present. I am mine. The body of water means I can coexist with contours of my own and imagine what this shape might be. Once I ran into a lake lit by moonlight with people who knew me as a boy. Some of them stripped entirely down, showing the night the parts of them which never saw the sun. I ran with them into the water. This time I was still a boy." So there's this tremendous possibility contained in water here, the possibility of freedom from particular types of categories and restrictions that connect to and are imposed upon the ways in which our bodies are gendered. And with that, I'm going to go over here to look very briefly at a piece by Sable Elise Smith. So this work by Sable Elise Smith, which is called 7,666 Nights Falling, is a complex interplay of a lot of different themes. But I want to talk about it in relation to the idea of water as a form of escape. So here, the photograph that's being used in this image is a Polaroid taken in prison of the artist's father. Much of Sable Elise Smith's work deals with her father's incarceration and with the experience of trying to visit somebody whilst incarcerated or engage with the body and the human life that is contained in that particular way. Here, she has actually collaged a waterfall over the top of the image. So you don't see the faces of the people who are depicted. You see instead this waterfall, which might be why it's titled Falling. To me, there is this idea of the tropical island that is kind of present in this idea of the waterfall, this idea of water as escape, or almost like the idea of marinage and freedom that comes from the landscape. It's a complicated piece because the history of photography with African Americans presents a lot of different possibilities and restrictions. It's a history at once of self-representation and of surveillance. But there's a specific amount of information that's required to understand this piece, and that is that only the incarcerated person is allowed to pay for the photograph that is taken here. Anytime that a photograph is taken with visitors, they are restricted to pay for them themselves, and they can't be given the money to pay for them. And that seems simple enough when you think that, well, maybe the photograph costs between $2 and $4, but in fact, prison labor in America is wildly under-remunerated, and at a rate of something like 15 cents an hour, it would have taken the artist's father 33 hours, roughly, to earn enough money to pay for this photograph. So it represents a distillation of the ways in which photography might at once represent a kind of freedom, or a kind of escape, a kind of self-representation. It might represent kinship relationships and family, but it also represents surveillance and capture, and the carceral system itself, which might be why this little cell, this single space, is so small within the large swathe of black that's overhanging and surrounding the work. We're going to finish today by looking at the final work in this exhibition, which is a video piece by Kenneth Tam. Kenneth Tam here has become interested in the idea of the prom as something that invites a kind of sense of social belonging, a sense of growth, and the kind of social rituals that mark going from childhood into adulthood. And for this work, he's brought together two generations of queer men who think about the idea of the prom as, that marker of achievement, graduating from being in school and becoming a man. It's a look at tenderness and masculinity, at the idea of the artist, that the artist has had about being able to assume different roles in society. And it's a look at what it means that our culture has changed and loosened up enough that maybe even 15 years ago, bringing a boy to prom would be something that people were afraid to do, and that this younger generation is able to do that. So the dance scenes in here are interspersed with interviews between the older and younger men, where they reflect on their experience of prom, and the younger men reflect on their hopes for and excitement about prom. And it's really a kind of a very soft, tender, ambiguous, open-ended study of what different rituals within our society allow us to do with our genders, and really finishing, I think, on the idea that another kind of masculinity is possible.